Unit 3, Morality and Ethical Behavior. Philosophy 101. This unit deals with the issues of right and wrong, good and evil, what we ought to do versus what we ought not to do in the context of our personal lives as individuals, but also in the context of the social interactive, how we respond to one another and how we treat one another, and what we insist in terms of moral rights and protections for ourselves, but also for everyone else. To begin this lecture, I would like to point out that morality and ethical behavior requires some kind of a source of authority to give it meaning and guidance. Now, there are a number of different kinds of authority and sources for the authority that we look to, and different people have different ideas about that. But I'm going to give you a list to start off of 5 prominent sources of authority in terms of morality. Of course, one is the highest possible authority, the superlative being, who is God. 2 is government and government control. 3 is elites, or those who are not in government, but they exert tremendous authority in terms of economics, in terms of business, in terms of education, and also on the government. These tend to be people who are very wealthy and who have a great deal of status and social prominence. And 4, tribal groups. These might be small in number, they might be very large. For example, it could be a group of your peers that you're involved with, in whom you invest authority concerning what's right and wrong. Or it could be a large group of people, such as a political party like the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. So those kinds of authorities function in a tribal kind of capacity, in that people align themselves as members and identify with the identity of the group, and then allow the group to mandate what's right and what's wrong concerning that group's perspective and viewpoint. And then 5th is the self, the individual. This involves absolute autonomy, in which the individual decides all matters of right and wrong with little or no regard to the opinions of others. And these sources of authority result in outcomes that directly flow from the kind of authority that we're talking about. In this unit, we'll be discussing a number of items. We will be looking at the Golden Triangle of Liberty as developed by Os Guinness in his collection of books on liberty, 6 of those. And we'll also be looking at another Os Guinness model, the societal cycle, which also comes from that same series of books. Then we will look at morality and ethics in particular, and some of the issues that are important to understand concerning morality and ethics. After that, we'll look at moral theories, consequential theories, deontological theories, and divine command theory, and then virtue orientation theories. We will evaluate those and analyze those as we proceed, and eventually we will conclude this unit with an examination of moral theory as presented by Jesus and Confucius. Now, Jesus and Confucius are in your textbook in the latter section of this unit. And Louis Vaughan, editor of your textbook, saw fit to include them, and I think he did this for a good reason, because their moral and ethical approach can be summed up in one statement, really, and it's almost identical or verbatim from each of these individuals concerning what morality should be at its core, at its essence. So we'll be looking at that as well. Now, what I'd like to do is start by talking about a little bit about the Golden Triangle of Liberty. The Golden Triangle of Liberty involves the idea that of course, liberty is important. And the triangle of liberty, it involves three components of liberty that must be interactive and ensured or protected together in order for liberty to actually exist and be sustained in a society or culture. Those three components are freedom, virtue, and faith. And if you imagine the apex of the triangle being freedom, the top point, as you move to the right clockwise, you might see an arrow going to virtue. And then as you go horizontally to the left of the triangle, another arrow that goes to faith. And then finally, an arrow moving upward back to freedom at the apex that completes the triangle. The reason for the triangle going clockwise is these elements are dependent upon one another. Freedom dependent upon virtue, virtue dependent upon faith, and faith is dependent upon freedom. So, freedom is essential if the moral life is to have meaning. One must be able to make legitimate choices concerning right and wrong. Therefore, the freedom to choose must be guaranteed. However, virtue is required in order for freedom to be protected. Without virtue, freedom is lost in one of two ways. On the one hand, freedom may be replaced by the abuse of power arising from human pride and corruption. And on the other hand, freedom may collapse under the weight of license or absolute autonomy, arising as well from human pride and corruption. Only virtue, which is really moral character, can ensure that freedom is maintained for all. Yet, virtue cannot exist alone. It requires faith. At this point, our discussion is not concerned with the object of faith, whether it be God or someone or something else. The point is that virtue requires a source which is greater than the individual. Only this type of source can provide the assurance that what one accepts as virtue and moral character is valid. This source is necessarily the object of faith. Without it, individuals are left with only their personal opinions and preferences concerning virtue, whether the opinions and preferences be solely those of the individual or shared by some particular collective. When this is the case, virtue is easily lost. In fact, history makes this clear. When the source for virtue is lost, the abuse of power follows, whether it be in the form of the individual's ill treatment of others or a government's abuse of its citizens. Of course, the better the source for virtue, the greater the assurance that virtue is valid. Finally, faith must have freedom. People must be free to have faith, to believe in whom and what they choose, and they must be free to express their faith. Therefore, the foundation is clear. Freedom needs virtue. Virtue needs faith. And faith needs freedom. All three are vital to what it means to live the moral life and protect and sustain liberty. Meanings matter. Therefore, the beginning point for analyzing morality is defining terms and clarifying concepts. Morality and moral norms. Morality. The moral thing is simply the right thing. A variety of ways to try and determine the right things have been proposed, and these will be examined in due course. The important point here is that morality insists that one thing is right while another thing is wrong. Morality should be a normative enterprise, and by this I mean that the moral or right thing should be something which can be demonstrated over time and across context as consistently being superior to its antithesis. Morality doesn't emphasize the letter of the law over the spirit of the law. This is the principle of overridingness, which means that when they are in conflict, the spirit of the law should win. This is because the spirit of the law emphasizes what is best for people, what is just and fair, whereas the letter of the law concerns itself solely with what is legal and how to implement what is legal. The spirit of the law allows for grace, compassion, and mercy, whereas the letter of the law is primarily focused on legality. Legisprudence is the term used for the letter of the law, whereas jurisprudence is the term used for the spirit of the law. If you remember the example that I gave you in class at an earlier time in the course of a person who speeds in their car through a school zone because their grandmother is having a heart attack and she's trying to get her grandmother to the emergency room. Well, a policeman parked by the school zone sees this person speeding, clocks him on radar, and turns on the lights and siren and pulls him over. The policeman is only concerned in this case with legisprudence or the letter of the law. This person was speeding. Cut and dried, as simple as that. The policeman chooses not to allow this woman to explain why she was speeding. He writes her the ticket, tells her that if she gives him any more trouble, he will arrest her, take her in, and jail her, along with her grandmother. Now that's the letter of the law, and I suppose it's legal to do something like that, but is it just and fair? The other scenario, jurisprudence, would allow the girl to explain why she's speeding and what's going on with her grandmother. The just and fair thing then would seem to be for the policeman to listen and then offer to give her an escort with his lights and siren to ensure that they arrive at the emergency room of the hospital safely and that the grandmother gets the help she needs. In doing so, perhaps her life is saved. Moral norms. In terms of morality being a normative enterprise, impartiality and universality and objectivity are three important components for establishing morality as normative. Impartiality means that morality applies equally to everyone. No favoritism is allowed when it comes to moral standards and behaviors. Princes and paupers alike are held accountable to the same standards of morality. Universality means that morality applies to everyone, regardless of time and place. Morality is not mutable. It should not be different somewhere or in some other time than it is now. Morality may not be amended by either individuals or groups. Objectivity means that morality should be reason-based. In other words, morality is not a matter of feelings or emotions, or even desires and preferences. The moral thing should be obvious when the principles of logic and reason are applied to moral choices and their outcomes. It should be obvious that the outcomes are directly the result of the moral choice in question, and superior in terms of actual benefits as opposed to harms. Ethics as moral understanding is an important area as well. Ethics addresses the implementation of morality. Morality identifies the right thing over the wrong thing, and ethics places the right thing into the context of relationships. Ethics has to do with behavior, whereas morality has to do with belief. The following items are beneficial in terms of implementing morality as ethical behavior. 1. Critical reasoning. Effective critical reasoning is vital in order to identify what is moral. It's also essential for determining the best way to implement the moral position in a relationship context. 2. Conscience. Conscience, that inner voice which serves to guide us in our moral choices and ethical behaviors, can also be of immense help. However, since the conscience may be compromised, that is, dulled or hardened, two important issues should be considered. First, the conscience must be kept sharp and tender, meaning that it must be submitted to a moral authority which can temper it correctly. This returns us to the source issue first presented in the Golden Triangle of Liberty. Second, the conscience must not be left to its own devices. What the conscience recommends should be consistent with the other elements useful in ethical behavior. 3. Obligation. Obligation or duty may also provide direction concerning morality and ethics. This involves knowing what one ought to do and also being held accountable to those standards, meeting expectations that conform to morality and ethical behavior. Of course, duty is only the right thing when it is directly connected to morality. Again, this point emphasizes the importance of a reliable source for morality. In addition, accountability requires such a source also, as well as input from other people, recognizing, however, that input from other people is only as good as their source for morality and their virtue. 4. Values. Values are also beneficial. If values are based upon a reliable source of information, and if these values are shared by people in a particular social context, morality may be achieved and upheld. 5. Actions and people. Morality and ethics can occur only within the context of relationships. Doing the good or the right thing is always directional. It requires an object toward which moral choices and ethical behaviors are directed. This object may be God, may be other people, or it might be nature, other creatures, and the environment itself. But I would ask you to consider this. If you were going to demonstrate that you were a moral, good person, a nice person, how could you do it? If you were in total isolation from other sentient beings, God, angels, humans, how would you demonstrate through relationship that you truly were a moral person? Because morality belongs to the realm of conscious, sentient, thinking people. And we require relationships with others who have those qualities in order to demonstrate the kind of people we truly are. Now I'd like to shift to Os Guinness's societal cycle for a few minutes and talk about the cycle and how it works and why it's important to our understanding of morality and ethical behavior. I would start by saying the societal cycle provides insights into the phases through which societies move over the course of time. There are 4 of these phases that are parts of the cycle. These phases progress logically, and unless something occurs which interrupts the process, the progression seems inevitable. For this portion of our lecture, I will be using the United States of America from around 1955 up to the present, because this period of American history clearly illustrates the 4 phases of the societal cycle and provides powerful examples of each phase. And of course, much of this material is probably going to be more familiar to you, even though you may not have lived through some of those phases in modern history. Phase 1, repressive society. The societal cycle begins when a society is experiencing a fairly high degree of order and control. The social authorities work in concert to maintain structure and order. The authorities may be governments, schools, religious institutions, corporate entities, or families. The underlying principle here is that authorities are good. Therefore, they should be obeyed. However, in terms of authority, the human tendency for those in seats of power is to maintain their current level of authority and also work to increase it. This tendency points toward becoming a repressive society. This is because the power of the minority and control at the top increases, while freedom for the majority at the bottom decreases. As freedom decreases for the masses, disenchantment and unrest and resentment begin to build. If the issues concerning losses of freedom are not addressed and the abuses of power rectified, the tension will increase to a breaking point. If the people can exert enough pressure upon the authorities in charge, the repressive phase will begin to give way to phase 2, the permissive phase. The permissive phase begins when authority relaxes its grip on the lives and the freedoms of the people. The philosophical viewpoint in this phase is that authority may be either good or bad. Therefore, authority must be questioned and perhaps challenged. As we saw in the repressive phase of society, the human tendency is to increase power, not diminish it. This is true for individuals the same as it is for groups and institutions. As a result, when society starts becoming more permissive, in the positive sense of allowing greater freedom and liberty for individuals, the tendency toward ever increasing freedom is inevitable. Individuals like freedom, and this is just as it should be. But the problem is where to draw the line. What begins in a promotion of positive liberty as authority permits greater freedom for individuals can rapidly deteriorate into a push toward negative liberty in the form of absolute autonomy for the individual. This results in the rejection of all external authority, even if the authority is beneficial and legitimate. If the tendency toward the individual's absolute autonomy proceeds unchecked, the third phase of the societal cycle will undoubtedly occur, the transgressive phase. The transgressive phase of society views authority as bad and illegitimate. Therefore, authority must be opposed and defied. This phase also receives powerful support and validation from the philosophical perspective best described as postmodern nihilism, arguably the single greatest philosophical influence on the modern world. This is because, as external authority is opposed and dismantled, the only authority that remains is that of the individual, and, since freedom is power, Nietzsche's nihilistic, quote, will to power becomes enchanting and enticing. In common vernacular, will to power translates as, quote, I will do what I want, when I want, to whomever and with whomever I want, and I defy anyone to criticize or oppose me. This transgressive spirit, which celebrates the individual self and personal power through the breaking of the law and the violation of rules and standards, if left unrestrained and unchecked, inevitably leads to anarchy and chaos. As a simple example readily demonstrates, imagine a community where everyone drove cars with a total disregard for traffic laws and drove any way they wanted with no concern for the safety and well-being of anyone else. The logical consequences are obvious. Potential great harms will likely occur. Or, just recently, in the wake of the tragic death of George Floyd, we saw riots in many of our major cities where literally billions of dollars of property were destroyed, people's livelihoods were destroyed, many people were injured, and far too many were even killed. This was all due to riots and a lack of restraint and a lack of nerve and a lack of moral judgment from our leaders to step in and say, we need to stop doing this. There's a better way to address problems. It was Socrates who said that persuasion is always better than force. And it seems that we have kind of forgotten that, and perhaps we should be told that again and again and again. Obviously, societies cannot continue to exist when absolute autonomy reigns supreme. Unfortunately, societies facing extreme forms of the transgressive phase, rather than addressing and correcting transgressive abuses, instead tend to enter the remissive stage, stage 4. This is due to the fact that when liberty becomes license, it becomes increasingly difficult to apply the brakes to destructive behaviors, precisely because applying the brakes feels like a loss of freedom. The remissive phase affords what appears to be the least radical response to the anarchy and chaos arising from the lack of restraint in the transgressive phase. Just like with cancer, the remissive phase fosters a euphoric impression that all is well. This is because the symptoms associated with the malady are submerged. The sense of well-being arises from an inability to recognize that the negative destructive nature of transgression and its logical consequences remain. But the warning signs or symptoms for this condition are not visible. The cancer is still there. The patient simply doesn't feel sick. This principle also holds true for remissive society. Of course, the false sense of health can lead to even greater risk as the individual fails to recognize the real dangers at work. Society continues to deteriorate as transgressive behavior continues unchecked. Like the frog in the pan of water, the danger goes unrecognized. The water heats, slowly reaching the boiling point, but the frog is unaware of the danger, peacefully enjoying the warming sensation until it is too late. And the frog dies from the boiling water. As the remissive phase threatens to completely destroy society, one of two outcomes will emerge. On the one hand, society may collapse into utter chaos and ruin. On the other hand, external authority may reassert itself and take control. Therefore, the cycle is completed in a return to the repressive phase. However, this return tends to become more authoritarian in order to stop the spiral into anarchy and chaos. Historically, this is readily documented in the numerous totalitarian regimes which have followed revolutions built upon nihilistic absolute autonomy. For example, the French Revolution of 1789, the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, and so forth. The losses of liberty and losses of life bear grim testimony to the dangers inherent in allowing the societal cycle to run its course. The Russian and the Chinese revolutions alone objectively credited for the loss of over 100 million innocent lives. All of this raises the following questions. Can anything be done to avoid completing all of the phases of the cycle? If so, what provides the antidote or solution? What is the best approach to breaking the cycle? Breaking the societal cycle. Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling and Sickness unto Death offers a meaningful response. He does this by proposing the individual's respect for and submission to God, the ultimate authority. Kierkegaard affirms that God is not only the ultimate authority, but also the only authority that is absolutely good and moral. God, therefore, functions relationally from the perspective of agape, the Greek word for unconditional love, which is love that is unconditional in the sense that it focuses on the ultimate well-being of its object. The object is humanity and creation, in particular, individual humanity, with whom God desires a personal relationship. Kierkegaard explains his idea in terms of a person becoming a, quote, knight of faith. That's knight with a K, like a knight in armor, questing for the holy grail of goodness and morality. Like the knights in the Arthurian legends, this person's focus is unflinching and unwavering. He turns his entire being away from worldly means and ends to live in pursuit of the only certain source of goodness and morality, God. Kierkegaard calls this approach, quote, living for the audience of one, capital O, the only one who has the answer. He further stresses that if every person does this, the negative impacts of the societal cycle will be overcome and the cycles will be broken. Freedom will increase, anarchy and chaos will diminish, and authority will be positive and beneficial as it comes under the supreme authority of God. Kierkegaard was no fool. He also recognized that becoming a knight of faith is entirely a matter of personal choice and cannot be coerced. He further realized that not everyone will make this choice, no matter how beneficial the results may be. Therefore, Kierkegaard's Christian existentialism, which is very positive in contrast to Nietzsche's nihilism and Jean-Paul Sartre's pessimistic or negative existentialism, provides a hopeful alternative to the relentless phases of the societal cycle. However, the Christian existentialism expressed by Kierkegaard has to be lived day by day, moment by moment, in relationship to God Himself, who personally guides, informs, and empowers the individual to break the societal cycle. Having examined the societal cycle, we must now turn to the question of liberty. A brief analysis of the two aspects of liberty are vital to furthering our discussion of morality and the various moral theories which have been proposed by numerous philosophers. Liberty, as understood in the classical sense of personal freedom and responsibility, has two sides: negative liberty and positive liberty. This double-edged sword of liberty cuts both ways, but it does so in a manner which safeguards freedom and responsibility by promoting and enhancing the highest ideals of morality and ethical behavior. Each edge of the sword of liberty needs to be sharpened in turn, and of course, liberty is dependent for this sharpening upon freedom, virtue, and faith. Negative liberty. Negative liberty is understood as freedom from or against restraint. Morally speaking, this type of freedom liberates the individual from inappropriate impositions of power and authority which abuse individuals by enslaving them to the control of authoritarianism. Negative liberty is crucial because without it, positive liberty is severely hampered. Where slavery exists, regardless of the type of slavery, and there are various kinds, racial, sexual, economic, etc., the very nature of slavery prevents the individual from freely choosing, and the loss of the freedom to choose restricts a person's ability to become, rendering him unable to determine and express the character and behavior one prefers. Therefore, negative liberty is important because it addresses the abuses of power, and abuses of power make positive liberty impossible to attain. So why is positive liberty important? Well, positive liberty emphasizes the individual's freedom to choose in favor of what is good and right. This means that the individual has the freedom to aspire toward the highest moral and ethical ideals possible. Of course, this freedom also permits the individual to choose against the moral and ethical, but so choosing inevitably leads to negative consequences for oneself and others. The hope is that individuals will see the importance of negative liberty as it relates to positive liberty, and then choose in favor of the morality and ethical behavior that is truly good. One must also concede that negative liberty without positive liberty is a guiding force all too quickly and easily degraded into moral and ethical license, which destroys morality and ethics altogether. Unfortunately, in postmodern culture, the emphasis has been almost exclusively placed upon negative liberty, or the, quote, freedom to do what one pleases with no restraint. Positive liberty has largely been dismissed or ignored. The harmful impacts of this omission are clear and obvious in terms of individual and cultural problems. This, of course, once more ties directly into postmodern nihilism, which denies responsibility for others and accountability to others, emphasizing instead the exercise of personal will and power. The fact that attempted suicides and tragically successful ones for the 18 to 30-year-old demographic are at record highs should sound the alarm. Furthermore, the fact that the number one cause of death in the 18 to 40-year-old demographic in the United States over the past year, this would have been 2021, 2022, that range, was not COVID. It was not cancer. It was not car accidents, but it was fentanyl overdose. This fact is directly attributable to the hemorrhaging of illegal immigrants across the southern United States border who are either paying the drug cartel huge sums of money, which fuels the drug trafficking culture, or who are working with drug cartels to bring this dangerous drug illegally into the United States. An emphasis upon positive liberty would do much to provide a solution to this problem and to others. And this would be possible, by the way, without government intervention. Negative liberty is required to protect positive liberty. Positive liberty is essential as the means for preventing the abuses arising from negative liberty alone. And liberty is only liberty when negative liberty and positive liberty work together. Having established a foundation and a background for morality and ethical behavior, we can now proceed to examine the various theories that philosophers have proposed and advocated as explanations and defenses of morality and ethical behavior. Moral theories. A. Consequential theories. These are theories which connect moral consequences and outcomes to ethical behaviors. Simply stated, morality is understood as that which results in benefits rather than liabilities for human beings. Proponents of this perspective include Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who argue utilitarianism as the best consequential approach to morality. A distinction, however, must be made between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. In the former case, the rightness of beliefs and actions depends solely upon overall well-being that accrues from those beliefs and actions. In the latter, the rightness is based upon adhering to rules of behavior which, if consistently followed, create for all concerned the most beneficial balance of well-being over harm. Jeremy Bentham. Bentham represents the classical position regarding utilitarianism, which is, generally speaking, the greatest good for the greatest number. In his view, hedonism, or self-pleasure, is the basis of morality. The utility that is emphasized is pleasure, or happiness, a pleasure that is focused on the individual, and personal happiness becomes the only intrinsic good. John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill, in contrast to Bentham, asserts that pleasure may vary in terms of quality and quantity. In his view, lower and higher pleasures exist. Lower pleasures are more base and animalistic, as displayed in urges like lust and greed and physical enjoyment. Higher pleasures involve things like the pursuit of knowledge, the appreciation of the arts, and personal creativity. Therefore, should lower and higher pleasure come into conflict with one another, higher pleasures should override the lower ones, since they produce a greater sense of well-being. Hence, Mill observes, quote, "It is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." End quote. Ethical egoism. Ethical egoism focuses entirely on how the individual feels. The moral thing is that which one prefers, and no other considerations matter. This approach manifests itself in two ways. First, subjective relativism. This viewpoint asserts that morality is solely in the eye of the beholder. The individual decides based on personal preferences and personal beliefs and personal benefits. No objective standard exists by which to measure morality or by which to hold ethical behavior accountable. Second, cultural relativism. This perspective is the cousin of subjective relativism. In this case, the social or cultural collective determines morality. Once again, this is based entirely upon preferences and benefits and pleasure. The only difference is that the perspective on morality is not individual, but a shared viewpoint. So the collective, which has the greatest power for asserting its moral position, becomes the arbiter for what morality means and what constitutes ethical behavior. Cultural relativism also exhibits tendencies toward the, quote, myth of tolerance. This myth promotes acceptance and tolerance for one's own group while justifying intolerance and the rejection of other individuals and groups. Finally, cultural relativism actually promotes intolerance. This is because the cultural status quo is seen as morally correct. Therefore, any opposition to that viewpoint, in terms of social reforms and cultural changes, must be rejected and opposed, because they are seen as morally wrong. Consequentialism is obligated to respond to some legitimate questions. 1. On what basis can one defend the idea that pleasure or a sense of well-being or happiness be accepted as intrinsically moral? 2. How is the, quote, greatest good for the greatest number, end quote, determined? Ethical egoism is also obligated to answer some legitimate concerns. 1. On what basis does one claim that personal preferences and personal pleasures make something moral? 2. On what basis does one claim that shared preferences and shared pleasures make something moral? 3. How does one know what is ultimately in one's best interests? 4. Is it reasonable to place one's faith, trust, and confidence solely in one's own infallibility, which, of course, is easily exposed as a fallacy? 5. Is it reasonable to place one's faith, trust, and confidence solely in the infallibility of the group collective, which, again, is easily exposed as fallible? Finally, something should be said concerning the syllogism upon which ethical egoism is founded. The syllogism argument goes like this. A. We are obligated to act only if we act. B. We can act only when motivated by self-interest. And C. We are obligated to act only when motivated by self-interest. In this syllogism, there are some problems with the premises. The challenge and response goes like this. A. Premise number 2, the idea that we can act only when motivated by self-interest, is false. B. The theory is inconsistent with considered moral judgments. For example, murder and robbery are morally right if they serve our self-interest. And C. The theory directly conflicts with an essential element of moral life, impartiality. The syllogism is valid only if premises 1 and 2 are correct. Premise 1 is logical and therefore makes sense. However, premise 2 is a fiat assertion to which there is ample logical and evidentiary opposition. In fact, common sense and observable phenomena indicate that premise 2 is false. Therefore, the syllogism fails. Now, let's take a look at deontological theories and divine command theory. These are theories in which morality is determined objectively as the result of a transcendent source, God, who has revealed what is moral and right by revealing himself, his essence, and nature, and doing so personally and through other types of revelation as well, such as the writings found in the Bible. Therefore, the moral or the right thing has intrinsic value of belief and action, and therefore the individual is obligated to conform to these standards. Morality is not determined by outcomes or results. In this view, the rightness of something transcends both feelings, pleasure, and the consequences arising from moral ethical behavior. A major proponent of this view is German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant upholds the categorical imperative as the basis for his deontological approach to morality. The categorical imperative establishes that something is moral intrinsically. Therefore, one's obligation and duty is to conform to that moral position no matter what happens. This is because the categorical imperative is consistent with the very nature and essence of God, who is morally good. For example, Honesty is seen as intrinsically moral. So telling the truth is a duty and an obligation. And by the way, the viewpoint here is that the outcomes or results of telling the truth are always ultimately beneficial to oneself and everyone else. Neither circumstances, nor feelings, nor outcomes have any bearing on this duty. One should also note that Kant, as a Christian theologian and philosopher, believed that the intrinsic morality to which he appealed was an extension of the moral nature of God, which God had revealed through the Bible and via the incarnation of Jesus Christ, and which also God had implanted or endowed man with via the Imago Dei, God's image. Of course, Kant's categorical imperative must also address some legitimate concerns. 1. How does one demonstrate that a moral position is in fact an extension of God's divine nature and morality? And 2. How does one reconcile the negative consequences which may be unavoidable if one absolutely conforms to the categorical imperative? And do these negative outcomes matter? And do the negative outcomes ultimately become justified as ultimate good and ultimate benefit in the end? Further treatment of some of the issues concerning divine command theory are presented in the short story Old Fool, which will be distributed as a handout in an upcoming class session. Finally, virtue orientation theories are important to examine. These theories emphasize the development of the kind of character from which ethical behavior arises. The focus is upon, quote, heart before action, end quote, as a demonstration of personal virtue. The emphasis upon caring for others and compassionate responses to the suffering and needs of others is laudable. However, if the focus becomes, quote, proving that one is virtuous, that one is a good person, then genuine or authentic compassion suffers. Etymologically speaking, compassion derives from the Latin compassio, meaning to suffer with. From the Koine Greek, we receive sun, spelled S-U-N in English characters, S-U-N, meaning with, and pathema, pathos, meaning feeling, suffering. Certainly, compassion begins in the human heart, but the expression of compassion is not about demonstrating one's own goodness or correctness. It is all about caring for others and serving their needs. Therefore, the current emphases on political correctness and virtue signaling cannot help but fall short of true compassion and service, which means to be willing to suffer with another. Jesus once recommended that when we do good for someone, we should do it with an intent to privacy, a personal exchange between us and them, in order to protect them. He added that we should not proclaim it publicly for the purpose of calling attention to our own goodness by pointing out the destitution and helplessness of others. Furthermore, an additional problem is the tendency, once again, for political correctness and virtue signaling to create an, quote, us versus them mentality. When this occurs, the grand appeals to acceptance and tolerance dissipate, and intolerance and rejection becomes the response to those who differ from ourselves. This easily degrades into arbitrary decisions concerning who should receive compassion and its benefits and who should not. The following questions provide further meaningful talking points in this area. 1. How does one determine, quote, character or the lack of character? 2. What do the ideas of a sinful, corrupt, and fallen world propose concerning character and the moral ethical struggle? And 3. How may one know what virtuous character means in the first place? What difficulties arise if human nature is morally flawed or sinful? And if creation itself is flawed due to the consequences and effects of sin or evil? These three theories are all important to understand. Consequentialism, deontological divine command theory, and virtue orientation theory comprise significant approaches to morality and ethical behavior. The question for each one of us becomes, which of these theories provides the greatest benefit and the least harm? Which of these theories is best in terms of logic, reasoning, and evidentiary support? Which of these theories will ultimately become a basis for each one of us in our lives in terms of what we come to believe and defend as morally right, and what we then do in terms of our ethical behaviors as we relate to one another? This concludes this lecture, and in upcoming class sessions we will explore these three approaches more deeply and attempt to come to some conclusions about which of the views is the most beneficial in terms of morality and ethical behavior.